This is a 2006 Mazda RX-8, and it's one of the more interesting modern sporty cars. Most of the reason for that is the Rotary engine, which I'll get to shortly, but it isn't just that. And if you're looking for a quirky, fun, sporty car, and you're tired of seeing all these Nissan 370Zs and Mustangs and Challengers and BMWs, you might consider this. Today, I'm going to review the RX-8 to find out if you should. I've borrowed this RX-8 from a viewer here in the San Diego area, and I'm going to start with a little background. Now, the RX-8 came out back in 2004, and it replaced the Mazda RX-7 after a 10-year gap in Mazda's North American lineup. But while the RX-7 was a two-door, two-seater, the RX-8 had 4 seats, and it had 4 doors, 2 normal front doors and then 2 half-sized rear doors. The RX-8 was sold in North America from 2004 to 2011, and you could get it in one of 2 ways, with a manual transmission or with an automatic. If you got the manual, you got 238 horsepower and about 160 pound-feet of torque. But the automatic was a penalty. It dropped you down to just 197 horsepower. Later, Mazda bumped the horsepower rating of the automatic up to 212, but it was still shy of the manual's 238. The most interesting thing about the RX-8 was its rotary engine, which functions differently than a typical car combustion engine with pistons and cylinders. The RX-7 also used a rotary engine, but the RX-8 has been the last car ever to use a rotary because there are a few drawbacks, which I'll cover in a few minutes. These days, used RX-8 models are pretty affordable. They range on AutoTrader from about $17,000 for low-mileage, late-production R3 versions down to about $4,000 for high-mileage, early-production examples. That's not a lot of money for something that's so unique. So today, I'm going to check out the RX-8 and find out if it's worth considering. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of it and show you all of the quirks and features of the quirkiest Mazda of the 2000s. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a DougScore. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the RX-8 with one of its most bizarre quirks, and that would be its key. Your car probably has a key that looks like this, or maybe like this, not the RX-8. The RX-8 key looks like this, which is very unorthodox. It's a rectangle, very thin, with 4 buttons at the top. Now, the images on these buttons have worn off, but I would imagine it's lock, unlock, and then maybe the trunk and the panic button. The intent for this key was that you were supposed to use it like a credit card. You would stick it in your wallet, and then you would always have your key with you. You didn't need to carry around a bulky keychain, a very strange way to do it. Now, if the battery dies in this credit card key and you need to get out the actual physical key, you can just pull it out the corner and it comes right out. But generally, you were just supposed to leave it in credit card form and go about your day. And once you've used that key to get into your RX-8, you will notice quite a few interesting quirks and features in here, starting with a rather circular theme in this interior. There are circles everywhere. We'll start with the steering wheel, which is of course a circle in itself. Then in the middle you have a circle, and then within that a circle, and then the Mazda logo is a circle. You also have a circle at the base of the gear lever, and then the climate control vents on the dashboard are also circles. But the circle theme really makes itself known in the center control stack. We have circles everywhere. Starting with the bottom, you have circles for the dials and the climate control. That's not uncommon, but you also have a circle for the climate control buttons, which is certainly unorthodox. Moving up, you have a circle for the volume control, and then on either side of the stereo, you have circles for various different stereo controls. But of course, the biggest circle in here is the giant circle in the middle, which has no apparent function other than to focus yourself on the fact that the RX-8 is all about circles. And by the way, if you open up the ashtray, you can see even more circles in the form of 37 cents the owner left in this car when I picked it up to review. Looks like Doug is 37 cents richer. Anyway, moving on from all the circles, there are far more quirks and features in this interior beyond that. I want to start with the beeping, because this car beeps every time you press a button. Not just some buttons, but any button in the center control stack gets a beep. Take a listen. Now that is incredibly annoying. Change the radio preset, beep. Change the climate controls, beep. It just beeps and beeps no matter what you press, which it absolutely shouldn't. You don't need that feedback. Pushing a button is feedback enough. And next up, another interesting quirk of the RX-8, drop the sun visor and you can see you have a visor mirror in the middle, and on either side you have little holes, which is weird because that means the sun visor actually lets in sun through those holes, which is strange. I mean, if it was me, I would think the purpose of the sun visor is not to let in sun, but I guess Mazda has a different take on this issue. And next up, another interesting quirk in the RX-8 would be the parking brake. For one thing, it's over on the passenger side, which is a little strange, but they had to do that for packaging. To me, the weird part is that it's huge, not just a parking brake, but it's actually like a whole handle, which you don't really need. And when you pull it up, it really sticks up in this interior, almost like you're waving the parking brake flag. And next up, another quirk of the RX-8 is a cool Easter egg. Like I mentioned, this car has a rotary engine, and one of the main components of that is a rotor that kind of spins around, which is shaped triangularly, sort of like a Dorito, people call it. Mazda has integrated the look of the rotor into the interior in a few places. One is on top of the gear lever. You can see it's kind of triangular up at the top, which is a cool look, and it reminds you that you're driving a special rotary car. You also have that rotor integrated into the seat back. You can see on the seat backs you have this triangle, which is the rotor that's in the engine. One of the things that makes the car unique, again, brought into the interior. Your non-rotary passengers probably won't even notice, but you will. And next up, another interesting quirk in here. This car has a coolant sensor that's broken, and so the coolant light is on, which is not really a problem. I only mention it because the coolant light is rather interesting. Take a look at it. It looks like a circus tent that would contain a carousel, or maybe the front of a trolley. It's a very weird light, and if I saw that light illuminate, my first thought wouldn't be coolant, it would be there's a trolley in my midst. And finally, our last interesting quirk up front here is the cup holder placement, which is absolutely terrible. It is inside this little center console storage area. You pull the lid back and it reveals the cup holders. But being inside the storage area, that's not my biggest problem. My problem is actually the fact that it blocks your ability to shift gears. Take a look at this. With a drink in the cup holder, you can't reach over. It blocks your forearm from easily being able to shift gears. It is a terrible placement for the cup holder, especially in a car that was presumably designed to be a manual car first and foremost, with an automatic second. They really should have thought that through better. And next up, we move on to the back seats, which is where the RX-8's real quirks start to begin. And that's because of the door situation. Now, I guess that when Mazda brought back the rotary engine sports car, they figured they couldn't bring it back as a two-seat, two-door car. There just wouldn't be enough mass market appeal to justify the cost. So they did something a little different. There are back seats and there are half rear doors in this car. And to get in, you first have to open up the front door, and then there's a little handle in the door jamb. You take that little handle, you pull that, and that will open up the rear half door, which is hinged in the back. And so that way, when both doors are open, you can see there is a rather large opening on the side of this car, since it's basically 1.5 doors worth of opening, but that's how you get into the back seat. Obviously not as practical as a true four-door car, but more practical than most sports cars with only two doors where you have to kind of fold the seat forward and climb in. But when you create doors like this, some interesting things happen. One of which is the way that I showed you to get into the back just now is the only way you can get in. You have to open the front door first if you want to get in to the back. You can't open the back door independently. And here's another one. The front door won't close unless the back door is already closed. So you don't want to accidentally close the front door and then try to close the back door because it will damage things. That's not how it's supposed to go. You have to first close the back door and then the front door will close because the front door latches in to the back door. And next up, once the doors are in this position, it's time to climb inside the back of the RX-8. And I will say, it's a lot easier to get into the back of this car with doors like this than if you were getting into the back of a normal coupe with normal coupe doors. Trust me, I've tried. Of course, that assumes that the seat is far enough forward, but in this case, it is. So getting in is as simple as just kind of sitting down and you're in. Pretty easy. Now, I will say, when you're in the back of this car, you don't really get all that much room. My legroom right now is deceptive because I've moved the front seat as far forward as it can go, which won't really be a comfortable position for most drivers. The owner of this car told me he considers it to be a 3-seater. You have the driver and then 2 people seated on the passenger side. If you have to actually put someone behind the driver, it can get very painful and very tight. Now, next up back here, there are a few other notable items that involve getting in, and one of them is the front seat belt. You can see when you open up the back door, a seat belt kind of comes out along with it. That is the front seat belt for the front seats because it's the only place they can really put it where it would still be reachable if you get into the front seat and you want to put on your seat belt. So if you're climbing into the back, you have to kind of climb over, work your way around that front seat belt. Another interesting item back here, once you're seated in the back, even though you have your own door, you don't have your own way to get out. Like I mentioned, the front door has to open first and then the back door opens, and that means even though you have a rear door handle back here, it doesn't do anything unless the front door is already open. So in that sense, it's like a coupe. You basically have to wait to get out until the people in the front let you. And next up, another interesting item back here is the rear window. Even though you have a relatively large window and your own door, the window doesn't roll down. It does, however, open up. You can open it just a little bit with this little plastic clip. You can push it out and get a little air back here, which is useful, but you don't have the ability to roll down your rear window like in sedans. Now, aside from all that, there's not really all that much interesting back here. Obviously, you only have 2 seats, like I mentioned before, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, 4 total seats, so there's no middle seat back here. Other than that, though, you have a little storage cubby in the middle. You can open it up and see that there's storage in there, although frankly not really all that much. Behind the storage cubby, between the seats, you have another piece that opens, and that would be a trunk pass-through. You open that up and you can access the trunk in case you have long items like skis or lumber that you want to load into your RX-8. Interestingly, this trunk pass-through has a keyhole on it, so you can lock it if you want, and that way you can make sure that nobody gets access to your trunk except you. And next up, moving outside the RX-8, we move on to one of my very favorite quirks about this car, and that would be in the fuel door. You open up the fuel door, and on the inside it says premium fuel only, like a lot of cars, but it also says super unique. Don't just put in regular premium fuel if you have an RX-8, you need super unique premium fuel. Or maybe it's saying that you need to put in premium fuel because the car is super unique. But either way, that's ridiculous. I don't know why it says that, but I love it. And next up, moving around to the back of the RX-8, we have another interesting quirk, and that would be the trunk. Now, you open up the trunk and you will find that it really has nothing special about it. It's just a trunk. It is fairly deep for a car like this, but really it is just a place where you put cargo, pretty standard. The interesting thing, though, is how tiny the opening is for the trunk. Take a look at this. It's so incredibly tiny. It's only maybe 12 inches from the bottom to the top. You can barely fit anything large back here, even though the trunk is big enough to handle it. Now, this happened, I suspect, because Mazda wanted to put usable back seats in this car, and that meant that they had to extend the roofline pretty far back. But they also wanted to make it sort of a small, sporty coupe, so space had to suffer somewhere. And where they took it from was the trunk opening. It's just a really, really tiny, basically, slot back here. But since I'm in the back of the RX-8, another item I want to talk about is the brake lights, which I find to be super cool. The brake light itself is in this little red circle on the inner part of the brake light. Then you have these little silver bars that extend out from the brake light. They look very cool, interesting, futuristic. Then you have the turn signal behind those bars. It's a very neat brake light, tail light assembly, and it brings some interesting style to a piece that is often kind of forgotten about. And next up, I want to move on to another interesting exterior item, and that would be on the B pillar, which doesn't actually exist because of the doors, but anyway, you have the word Shinka printed there. This is the RX-8 Shinka, which was a Japanese word meaning like transformation or evolution. It was supposed to be an evolved version of the original RX-8, and it was a special edition. So special, in fact, that there's only 1,400 Shinkas here in North America, but it didn't really add that much. A couple of cosmetic changes, slightly better shocks for improved handling, and some other small changes to improve ride quality. That was about it. Still, it's pretty cool, a slightly better version than your typical RX-8. And next up, we move under the hood in the RX-8, where you can see we have the Renesas multi-side port. How many ports do you have? Multiple. And they're on the side. No, but this is the rotary engine. I'm not going to get into how the rotary engine works. There's a lot of great YouTube videos that go into depth on why it's different from a traditional engine with pistons and cylinders, but I want to discuss why it wasn't used in more vehicles. The RX-8 went out of production in 2011, and no automaker has used a rotary since. And even before that, it was very rare, only used in a few cars over the years. So what are the drawbacks with the rotary engine? Well, one is fuel consumption. This is probably the biggest. In today's world of fuel economy standards for automakers, it's difficult to justify making a rotary engine. Here's what I mean. When the RX-8 came out back in 2004, it had worse fuel economy than a Chevy Corvette, which had a 5.7 liter V8 with 350 horsepower, whatever. This thing had 238 horsepower and worse gas mileage. Another problem that rotaries have is reliability, and specifically sealing the rotor within the engine. These seals are known to wear out, and replacement can be expensive and difficult. I will say though, in terms of reliability, the owner of this car has had it for more than 10 years, and he told me he hasn't had any real issues with the rotary powertrain. For the RX-8, the original two model years, 04 and 05, were known to be the bad years, and supposedly things improved beginning in 06. Whether or not that's true is a source of contention. But either way, the owner of this car has had it for more than 10 years and more than 60,000 miles with no real major problems. That is anecdotal evidence, of course. You shouldn't base a purchase decision off of it, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Now, the other issue with rotary power plants is oil consumption. Most car owners are used to never really doing anything about their engine oil. It's just dealt with when they get an oil change. But with rotary cars, you have to top up the oil constantly because the engine is designed to consume oil a lot more quickly, and so oil consumption could be a problem, especially if you're not good about staying on top of it. And when you combine fuel economy issues, oil consumption, and reliability problems, it makes sense why the rotary hasn't really been used again. Although Mazda swears every couple of years they're gonna bring it back, but it's been 10 years since this car went out of production, and they haven't done it since. And finally, we have to talk styling. And this is the part I'm dreading, because this is where I'm gonna get all the hate mail from the RX-8 owners. And that's because I don't like how this car looks. And more specifically, I hate how this car looks. I think it is a really bad looking car, one of the least attractive modern cars on the road. Now, I wanna start this by saying I'm in the minority here. Most people are either indifferent about the RX-8 styling or they kind of like it. Most people don't have such a strong negative reaction like I do, but I really don't like it. And there are a few reasons why. For one, I always felt that the wheelbase is too long. The car looks like it's stretched out in the middle, which is just not an attractive look. Now, they did that to get those extra rear doors in, but I think that came at the expense of the styling, and I think it looks really strange. Another thing I don't like about the RX-8 styling is the front wheel arches. They are unusually huge. They're way too bulbous and giant, and they just don't belong They're doing the car no favors. Another thing I didn't like about the RX-8's design was the rear window. It has this weird wraparound rear window, and the shape doesn't work at all with the shape of the glass on the side of the car, and it just really didn't work that well altogether. And finally, the last thing I didn't like about the RX-8 was the front license plate situation. Mazda did not design this car with any semblance of front license plate in mind, so when you stick one on there, it looks like a buck tooth and it blocks the entire front grille. It just screws up the design of the car. Not that it really needs any help getting screwed up, because in my opinion, the whole thing is not very attractive. And so those are the quirks and features of the Mazda RX-8. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the RX-8. Now on paper, this does not seem like a car that I would like very much. For one thing, I already told you I don't like how it looks. I also think 160 pound-feet of torque is basically shameful. It's ridiculous. And 238 horsepower isn't exactly that much either. It's just not a very appealing car on paper, especially when you're trying to follow up the FD RX-7, one of the all-time great Japanese cars. But as bad as to me this car looks on paper and stylistically, it is a brilliant drive. For one thing, it feels more lively than 240 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque would have you believe. It is surprisingly spry and peppy. But it isn't just that. This car handles so well. It does not handle like a modern sports car, like something brand new. But for 2006, it is unbelievable, especially when you consider that you have reasonably practical back seats. No reasonable four-seater car offered any handling anywhere near like this level back in 2006. And I haven't been in an RX-8 in a while, and I forgot just how sprightly and engaging and fun this car is to drive. It is a joy, it's a treat, especially because it revs fairly quickly and it gets going reasonably fast. Acceleration is not the high point. It could be better, no question about it, but to me, the steering and handling is just fantastic. You go around a highway on-ramp, you get on a curvy road, and it is hard not to be just super impressed by this car's capabilities. And it's even more impressive when you consider that this car is 15 years old. It's got 75,000 miles on it. This was 15 years ago. I mean, many modern sporty cars are still not this good at handling. This thing is really an impressive, tight, sharp car, and it's just a lot of fun to drive. Now, would I actually drive one? That is a different question. The owner told me his car's been very reliable for him. He told me most of the problems were confined to 04 and 05. This is an 06. To me, I wouldn't want to put up with dealing with a Rotary, and trying to find someone who knows how to deal with a Rotary is another problem. I imagine Mazda dealers are not the most friendly when it comes to working on Rotary engines. You show up with an RX-8 and they're probably like, get out of here with that thing. With that said, it is a good alternative to sort of more boring, normal sporty cars. I think this car outhandles a 350Z from this era. It just feels sharper, it feels better, even though it doesn't have that same reliable powertrain. And of course, you also get the benefit of these relatively usable back seats. Ultimately, I find this to be a relatively compelling car. It could use more power, but it's not that slow. It's not really fast, but it's not that slow until you really start getting up into the revs. But more importantly, it's just very sharp, it's cheap, it's different, and no, I don't like how it looks, but it's got a lot going for it despite that. And so that's the Mazda RX-8. This is a special car and a unique one, and it can be very much worth considering if you're looking for a sporty, enjoyable car that your neighbors probably don't have, and if you're willing to take on the challenges that come with the Rotary engine. If that sounds like you, these can be a lot of quirky fun for not that much money. And now it's time to give the RX-8 a DougScore.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I've never liked how this car looks, but I understand I'm in the minority, so I'll give it a relatively decent 6 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 6 seconds, so it gets a 4 out of 10. Handling is really sharp, not quite S2000 sharp, but surprisingly close given the extra size and seats, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Fun factor is good. It'd be higher if there was a convertible or more power, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Cool factor is okay. These are cooler than a lot of cars from this era because of the Rotary, but they're still not that special, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 29 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's normal for a car like this from this era, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is fine, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is poor. The interior is nice enough, but Rotary reliability issues are potentially very problematic, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Practicality is good. It has a bigger and more accessible back seat than any traditional coupe, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are cheap, but with reason. Most people are just afraid of ownership costs, and they're not that fast. But I think this car is too fun for what it costs, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 24 out of 50. Added up in the DougScore is 53 out of 100, which places it here against some other sporty cars from this era. The RX-8 is near the bottom, but most of this stuff is more expensive and was back when the RX-8 was new, too. Still, the RX-8 holds its own, and it would jump a few points if not for that Rotary engine, but that's part of the charm of what makes the RX-8 special.
RX-8 models are pretty affordable. They range on AutoTrader from about $17,000 for the... There is a little storage pocket behind the driver's seat like you'd expect, but there is not one on the hind of the passenger seat.